And now I'm going to introduce our speaker, who is a dear friend of mine and a colleague. This is Dr. Paranormal. He's a professor of
Professor Paranormal,
Loyd Auerbach. And I met Loyd in the 1980s when I was a graduate student at John F. Kennedy University studying transpersonal psychology. And I took a class with him on magic. Loyd is a magician as well as a parapsychologist. And the whole point of a magic class in a parapsychology program is to help researchers who are out in the field and investigators to be able to determine the difference between leisure domain and trickery and actual paranormal phenomenon. So I was acquainted with magic and parapsychology through Loyd in my 30s. And since then, he has been teaching parapsychology for 40 years. He teaches currently at Rhine Research Center, and he also teaches at the Atlantic University online courses in parapsychology. And I believe that's open to the public. So if any of you are interested, look it up at the Atlantic University. And he previously taught a parapsychology certification program at HCH. He's the author of 9 nonfiction books on the paranormal and 2 paranormal mystery novels. The most recent one is called Afterlife, A Rainy Day Investigation. And his most recent nonfiction book that I know of is called Psychic Dreaming. He's had media appearances in the thousands. And when my husband and I, Paul, watch all the paranormal investigation documentaries on TV, on a monthly basis, we're seeing Loyd's face on our big screen TV. He's very, very active in the media world, doing presentations and sharing his experience and wisdom. And I am very excited to share him with you today. Meet Loyd Auerbach.
Hi there. Well, let me launch right into it here. I do have a PowerPoint to go along with this because I thought it's important for you to kind of see various points that we deal with in parapsychology in terms of evidence, in terms of scientific evidence. And if anybody wants the slides, I'm happy to create a PDF and send it out. My email address will be at the very end on the last screen. You can kind of jot it down real quick or get it from Holly later on. So let's launch into this. Holly had asked me to talk about apparitions, about ghosts, but also the evidence for survival of consciousness after death, which made this a little bit more than what I would do normally for apparitions. So let me just kind of breeze right into this as much as I can and as quickly as I can so we can get to the ghostly stuff. All right, first, this is a slide I use with a lot of my classes. It's one I discovered years ago. It's very true. There's no such thing as a supernatural. There are only things we don't understand yet. That's the history of science is that, in fact. What parapsychologists study kind of falls into 3 buckets, although they're interrelated. There is extrasensory perception, which is information that we gather through non-sensory means. Psychokinesis, which is mind-matter interaction, mind over matter. We can affect things with our mind, our consciousness directly. And then survival of bodily death, of course, which is what we're here to talk about. Consciousness surviving the death of the body. We call all of that psi phenomena. Under ESP, we include telepathy and clairvoyance. We use the term clairvoyance, has been used since the 1800s as a catch-all for any real-time psychic experience of information that doesn't come from somebody's mind. Of course, part of, or one method of clairvoyant reception is called remote perception or remote viewing. And then, of course, there's precognition, which is knowing before, getting information in advance from a future or the future, depending on how you look at time. Retrocognition would be pulling information directly from the past, not the future. Psychokinesis covers a range of effects, our minds affecting many things. You'll notice at the top that I include healing of self, not just healing of others. Actually, technically, by our definitions, and the lack of understanding in medical science, the placebo effect and its opposite, the nocebo effect, are truly psychokinetic or mind over matter effects, our minds affecting our own bodies. So we don't just look outside the body, we look inside the body as well. We cover a wide range for everything from movement of objects and metal bending to effects on computers and other electronic devices, as well as grouped in there poltergeist cases, which I'll talk about in a bit. So for us, ESP is about knowing, it's about information. So you might call it paranormal cognition, paranormal knowing. Psychokinesis is about interaction and action. It is paranormal action. And when we talk about survival, we're talking about consciousness itself surviving the death of the body. That's a form of paranormal existence. With survival, there are certain buckets that we talk about. I'm going to actually touch on each of these to some extent for our evidence. And many of them can only be studied outside the laboratory. Out-of-body experiences pretty much, and mediumship are the two that we can bring into the lab and have folks do under controlled conditions. But for the most part, we're gathering people's experiences, studying the patterns and experiences, trying to figure out what's actually going on. We can follow up to find out if there's verifiable information, which is very important to us in what we do when we study these things. Now, Bruce Grayson, who is still with the University of Virginia, has been around quite a bit. I recommend his book, After. It's called After. It's about near-death experiences, but it talks about other evidence for survival as well. And he's a member of a group at the Division of Perceptual Studies in the medical school. And that is also the place where the longest running program on studying children who remember previous lives, cases of reincarnation, have been conducted since 1960. So these are the three items that Bruce puts forth as the best evidence for survival. And that's evidence that people living now had lived before, so reincarnation. Evidence that people now deceased still exist in some form and can interact. Evidence that the mind can function independently of the brain, even if you're still alive. But that brings us to the question at hand for us, and it's the root question. It's the question that comes up, and I actually throw back in people's faces when they challenge me about the proof of the existence of ghosts or survival. And if we are talking about consciousness, we don't have, in science in general, there's not a consistent consensus as to what consciousness is, whether it's just the brain or whether it's more than the brain. And even within neuroscience, there are different models of what consciousness might be, many of which are not just purely materialistic. So if science as a mainstream body cannot decide or define the thing that we say is surviving, it's very hard for us to say, yeah, I can prove the existence of that. You really can't prove anything in science anyway. Science is not a set of the dogma. It's not the bulk of knowledge. It's the process of learning about how the universe works. And it changes all the time. So when people talk about consciousness, it's any of these things: awareness of ourselves and the environment, self-awareness, the ability to process and integrate information, and how much information we can process and integrate. Giulio Tononi, who wrote a great book called Phi, P-H-I, it's a Greek letter, has defined it this way. And this way he can say that a cockroach has consciousness to some extent because it can process, it can integrate information, but not as much as a human being or a chimpanzee for that matter, or a dog or a cat. Some people define it as a sum total of our experience, memory, thoughts, feelings, and sensations, basically the programming that goes in. It's been used as an alternative for mind, for spirit, for soul. And if some physicists use that term very loosely to say that it's a fundamental property of the universe without meaning consciousness like human consciousness. Within my field, within parapsychology, which studies psychic phenomena, there is a divide, philosophical divide. And looking at the evidence for any of the things I'm going to talk about tonight can be looked at in two different ways, depending on the starting point someone has. So there are people who are pure materialists within the field of parapsychologists. So in parapsychology, we don't start with a particular philosophy about consciousness or the world, the physical world for that matter. We're trying to explore what we think are direct experiences of consciousness, whatever that may be. But there are materialists who would explain any psychic experience, including reincarnation memories, as a form of ESP, a super form of ESP, because it gets more information more directly than what you'd normally find in people being psychic. Those of us who subscribe to the idea that that probably is not it. We're not just physical meat robots. We're more than that. We might be dualists. We might have mind and body. We might have more than one one form of consciousness. We might actually not even have consciousness in the brain at all. It just may be that our brains are receivers of consciousness, which is kind of out here. And the brain is, well, like that broken TV set that Holly and Paul actually have right now. It doesn't receive a signal right now, I'm assuming. That does not mean the signal is non-existent. It just means the interface is not working right. And so we would be the interface in that case. So there's a lot of different models or ideas about how and what consciousness might be. And a lot of it has to do with the philosophy that someone holds to how the universe works and our place in it. Let's start with out-of-body experiences. This is a picture from the Doctor Strange movie. And somehow this is very weird. My slide, when I look at it on the regular normal view, I don't have that S separate. So we are having some weird things happening here. But actually, the idea of an out-of-body experience is you perceive your center of being. So your perception is from a point outside your body. Your perspective is outside your body. You may feel outside your body, but still not be looking from a different point in space. So for us, for it to be a psychic out-of-body experience, not just a psychological sensation, the perceived center of consciousness, your perspective, is located from outside your body and may include seeing your physical body. But are they evidence for survival? Does something really leave the body, or is it just remote viewing of some kind? Well, the evidence we look at is on the patterns of personal experience, especially in experiences where people have traveled someplace. The information they may actually pull back. So is that somatic? Is it ESP? I think I'm out of my body, but I'm really receiving the information and my mind makes me think I've gone out of my body, or have I gone out, exosomatic? Am I outside the body picking that up? There's witness perceptions of out-of-body travelers. People sometimes are seen as living apparitions, as apparitions of the living when they travel somewhere in an out-of-body state. And they remember that they saw the person, and the person will tell them, hey, I saw you here the other day, but how could you possibly have been here? You actually live in New York. Then there's detection of out-of-body travelers by devices. There was research going on for quite a long time at the American Society for Psychical Research and other places where the person going out of body was able to affect devices. Now, the question for us is whether the device affect mind over matter from the person laying down, not really going out of their body, just thinking he did. Did he just affect the device long distance? Or did his out-of-body presence affect the device, which is still mind over matter, but affect the device while he was actually present with the device? We have to look at these questions all the time. Out-of-body experiences happen with near-death experiences, and there are many characteristics that fall into the NDE list. For us, the more there are, the more likely it is a spiritual or psychic out-of-body experience, because some people don't only have little bits and pieces of this. There often, but not always, is an out-of-body experience with a perception, again, of the body's surroundings, including people who float above their body in an operating theater during surgery and then can recount almost word for word what was said, and also the description of what was done by looking into their own body. More importantly, they can sometimes travel the hospital, go to the next operating theater or someplace else and describe what's there, what's going on in a place that is absolutely positively outside the range of the body's normal senses. People do report movement through the darkness or tunnel towards a light. We hear about that quite often, but that actually is not across the world. In Japan, and some folks out in China, and different groups in China, and other Asian populations have reported going across a bridge or some sort of causeway over a body of water, usually a stream or a river, to a garden on a nice sunny day. And that's where they meet someone or talk to someone, usually often an ancestor that they're talking to. There is that bright light or bright sunny day that's common. People often talk about having encounters with deceased relatives or loved ones or religious figures specific to their religion. Sometimes they have what's called a Pekindarian experience, where they meet someone as they've gone through that tunnel or across the bridge, and they're a little bit surprised And when they come out of, when they're resuscitated, they say, I don't know how I could possibly have seen Bill. Bill's still alive, isn't he? And then they find out a little bit later that Bill died right before this individual had their near-death experience. There is often a sense of oneness with the universe, and sometimes a perception of a realm, a city of light, a garden, certainly is that garden in the Asian experiences of going across a bridge. So are near-death experiences evidence for survival? Well, the best, there's certainly evidence, like with an out-of-body experience, of separation of consciousness from the brain, and especially with out-of-body experiences with verifiable perceptions, local to the body, absolutely beyond the range of the normal senses. And we have on record visual perceptions by the blind, including people who were never sighted. And that in itself is really enticing evidence that we have. So there's also, the question is this evidence of consciousness moving on to a different level of existence, the other side? Is that a reality? Well, those encounters with the deceased, especially where there's verifiable information, and especially when they did not know the person was dead, those are important. There's absolutely that similarity of experiences. There's an emotional impact with the afterlife, going to that other side through the tunnel, across the bridge. People come back very often changed, and not just their perspective on life and death, because that would be sort of expected. But there's many, many other changes people have, including sometimes getting psychic abilities opening up after the experience. But certainly people have come back so changed by what they experienced on a spiritual level that it has led to relationships breaking up, new relationships forming, people changing careers, a wide range of experiential changes that would not happen and do not happen in other circumstances for people who experience a trauma, a bodily trauma. But we have to also remember that the person generally, but not always, has some degree of brain activity. That means the person is near death, not actually dead. All right, let's talk reincarnation for a moment. And I just want to preface this by saying we handle cases in a very specific way within our field, because we are trying to gather evidence that, and by excluding every other possibility. The work in reincarnation was first pioneered in 1960 by Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. It's been carried on there at the UVA by Dr. Jim Tucker. Erlander Haraldson, who passed away a couple of years ago at the University of Iceland, was doing quite a bit. And there are other folks in their specific circle, including a couple of anthropologists and others, Antonia Mills being one of them, who have dealt with these kinds of experiences. It's really baffling to many of us in our field how people are not interested in experiences or potential experiences of reincarnation, even if you don't believe it, given how many people in the world believe in reincarnation in some way, shape, or form. It goes way back. So what we study and what we're looking for are evidential cases of the reincarnation type, right? And we use the term court cases of the reincarnation type. From Bruce Grayson again, the best cases seem to have memories of a previous life that can be corroborated. Now I want to say corroborated, but also there you can actually, as much as possible, eliminate the possibility that the person was not exposed to that information at any point in their life, which makes it very difficult with adults. We look at personality traits, likes and dislikes, that seem to be carried from the previous life to the present life. Unlearned skills. You got a 3-year-old that suddenly can speak another language, which is bizarre. That's called xenoglossy. Or you have a 4-year-old who starts talking about having been someone and they can play the piano, never had a piano lesson in their life, or they can pick up another instrument, or they can paint or do something else, a skill. There's about 15% of the cases that are looked at, there are birthmarks or birth defects that when they are able to solve the case or track back who the previous personality this kid remembers finds that the birthmark or birth defect actually represents the mode of death, which is typically traumatic to the body of that individual, such as a birthmark ring around the neck, and they find that the person who was the previous personality died by being hanged. Or drowning might bring up, of course, a fear, a phobia, but there may be some other physical piece of the body that has a birthmark on it related to that. There are several cases where someone was knifed or shot, and there are specific birthmarks in the same spots that the previous personality was shot or knifed, was killed that way. So we mainly look at spontaneous recall. So we're not dealing with hypnosis, with regression. And I want to also say that without exception, I think everybody in our field, while we may not look at regression as a method of gathering evidence from a scientific perspective, because of too many other sources of information that might be in the mind or memory of this individual, we absolutely support past life regression as an incredible therapeutic tool. No question about that. And I've referred people to past life regression many times, and one of my colleagues actually makes his living doing that. So, so we look mainly at the spontaneous recall, and again, it's mostly kids, mostly children. We're looking at the themes are often the mode of death, people or events from that end of life, sometimes between the death and the subject's own birth. The average time period, although there absolutely are various exceptions, the average time period in the solved cases, the ones where they could figure out who the previous personality actually was, and there are many, many cases on record for the University of Virginia and Iceland, was about 15 months before conception. But there are some well-known cases that go back decades as well. What we find are behaviors related to the previous life, emotions towards the previous family. They want to see the family, phobias related to the mode of death, likes and dislikes, foods, addictive substances, even food allergies relating to the past life personality, the previous personality, themes in play, and even cross-gender behavior. And that's from Jim Tucker. Okay, so when we, in our field, the question does come up about spontaneous recall versus past life regression. And Ian Stevenson did this, looked at this very carefully, very early on, and really identified why we have to step away from past life regression, from any hypnosis, with adults especially. First of all, there is a question, is it, are we dealing with memory that's been copied or actual consciousness? With spontaneous recall, the problem that we've got sometimes with adults is that recall would almost have to be things that you can very clearly say, and same thing with past life regression, they would not have been exposed to in life. My colleague who has been doing past life regressions for regression therapy, I think he's probably been doing for 45 years. He's told me that every once in a while he runs into a case where he can ask a question, the person's coming through with what seems to be very factual information that makes sense, and he asks questions about the mundane things that past life personality might have run into. And I encourage you to do this as well. Somebody, he mentioned a farmer from 14th century France as one of his examples. And the guy had a lot of detail about 14th century France, but maybe he read a book as a teenager or in college about 14th century France. But Carrie started asking questions about, well, what was your typical daily food regimen? What'd you eat? Where did you eat? Where did you poop? In other words, asking very basic questions that would not have been in a movie, would not have been in a typical history book. You'd have to have had to read books about daily life in that area of France at that time period to even know that stuff. And he found that this one case, for example, he then would take all this information, go to UCLA's library, and he would confirm it by doing a lot of research himself. So it took him a while to find this kind of thing. So he did have occasional cases, but most of them he felt were not providing enough detail to really say that this could have been for sure a past life. Might have been, might not have been. So we keep that away from our true evidence. We're dealing with kids again. Some people suggested that what people are experiencing when they have spontaneous recall is possession. But there's a big difference that we see with these cases, even with mediumship cases, with trance mediumship and channeling and things like that. And the difference is, I have a kid who says he was someone in a past and knows that it was a past life, versus in trance mediumship or channeling, and a spirit comes in, that spirit doesn't say, I was so-and-so in life, I am that person. And we have other indications that it's definitely not possession in those circumstances. But our question is, what's reincarnated? Consciousness, memory, something else? Very important questions for us. And again, we deal with children who remember previous lives, because a 2, 3, and 4-year-old have not been exposed. They've been exposed to more information today than they would have been, let's say, 20, 30 years ago. But if you have a 2.5-year-old that starts speaking like an adult, with intonation, colloquialisms, and information about a past life, you can track that back and show, and if you can find that personality, but either way, you can pretty much eliminate that this is coming from just being exposed to something, watching television, or even if the kid could read on the internet. When we deal with mediumship, which is another form, and it's actually one of our 2 forms that is brought into the laboratory. We're doing quite a bit of work with spirit mediums these days, mainly mental mediums. There have been 2 types of mediums. The majority of mediums that you see, certainly everybody you see on TV, the people you hear about, the people you go for a reading, those are going to be mental or psychic mediums. And these are mediums who connect with spirit, they communicate. They typically don't have spirits jumping in their body. It happens once in a while. That's called a drop-in. They might go into an altered state. That would be a trance medium, if they're allowing someone to speak through them. And in other cultures, that's actually a pretty common thing as it happens. But these are mediums who can perceive spirit communication from whatever stage of existence we're talking about when you go to the other side. Mediums have told me, and I work extensively with mediums through an organization called the Forever Family Foundation. It's a nonprofit that actually supports the work of evidential spirit mediums in the family grieving process. And we also support the research and evidence for life after death, and the education of people, educating people about the science as much as possible. And we certify mediums and put them through their paces to make sure they're truly good mediums in many ways. And these folks have told me that who they're speaking with are not ghosts. They're not the apparitions I'm going to talk about. And I'll explain the difference in a bit. These are people who have moved on, however you want to describe that. And they're projecting themselves back from that other side, from that other realm, that other stage or place of existence, if you can even call it a place. Physical mediumship, which had to start when spiritualism really got started, and has evolved over time, especially between the 1850s and the early 1900s, to darker and darker and now pitch black environments, is about physical object movement as indications that the spirits are moving or working through a medium who is allowing them to use their body to create physical effects that prove the existence of spirit power. For us in our field, it's really tough to do research on physical mediums because of darkness and other things. And unfortunately, we keep running into frauds. That's a big problem. So for us to be good evidence of survival of spirit communication, we need verifiable information. And that's not just facts. It's not just what you could dig up on someone on the internet. What you see, what you experience as an observer when you see a reading, whether it's a group reading, a really good one. I'm not talking about what you see on TV, but a really good reading, either with another individual, a sitter, or with a group, is you get a sense, you get the sense that the medium's actually having a conversation with someone, not faking it, in other words. You also get indications of personality, not just factual information. How did the person behave? How did they chew? That came through at one point. What is a common thing the person would say in certain circumstances? The things that really make us us and not just the facts about us. We try to exclude in research psi or ESP with the living as best we can. And the current research at the Windbridge Research Center in Tucson, Arizona, has been able to do that with extraordinary controls, at least as much as one could possibly do that. And we also try to exclude fraud, and we always do exclude fraud and unconscious cold reading. Some unconscious cold reading. Cold reading is the idea of the ability to read someone. This is a learned skill. Reading someone cold when you meet them, for example, when you're looking at them. Sherlock Holmes was an amazing literary character who could do cold reading to a greater degree than anyone really could. So we do find that people do unconscious nonverbal communication. We see that. I mean, we all do that to some extent. We all read people even if it's not conscious. So we try to eliminate that by removing the medium, both visually and sometimes otherwise, from the communication with the living person whose spirit relative is being contacted. Evidential mediums, again, provide us with verifiable and specific statements about the deceased, a sense of their personality and behavior. For us, they have to do it under well-controlled conditions. There's Windbridge Research Center. They have blinded the situation to the point where the medium only knows a date and time to do a reading, and the spirit they're trying to contact's name is Sally. That's all they know. The person whose relative Sally is knows the date and time the medium's going to do the reading, but they have no contact with the medium whatsoever. They have to later on score, they have to figure out which of the transcripts they're given, because they're given more than one transcript for more than one reading, which one relates to their relative Sally, and then they have to score that. There have also been recent brain state studies that show that the brain activity of a medium when communicating or ostensibly communicating with spirits is different than when they're pretending to have a conversation with somebody like an imaginary friend, and when they're having a conversation with a researcher. All of those states are different. We finally look at the question of, for mediumship, where is the psi coming from? So people have said, well, really, it's the medium reading the mind of the sitter or picking up information from the Akashic records or from records otherwise. And we call that somatic psi. It's from the body, from the person. Survival psi is what's necessary for a spirit to communicate. So in other words, you have a spirit present, and we'll talk more about this with apparitions here in a moment. That being, that spirit, has no physical senses, has no way of making sound that normally, and certainly the rest of us in the room with the medium doing the reading aren't hearing the spirit at all. So the only way that that entity could perceive the world and communicate is with psi, with ESP, and PK to move things or affect things. So we have to kind of look at that. But when it comes right down to it, when a medium is communicating with a spirit of any sort, or a psychic is communicating with a ghost, with an apparition, or a witness is having a communication, it is the ESP of the living and the ESP of the dead. It's both. It's not just one or the other. Because I pick up a spirit perhaps with my ESP, but the spirit is putting out the signal and picking up what I'm thinking and saying with their ESP. So let's get into the ghostly stuff here. We have three areas, and I'm going to very briefly talk about apparitions and poltergeists, hauntings and poltergeists, just to give you a definition of how they separate for us, because they're very different things, although they can look the same quite often. And each one of those represents something different. So an apparition is that which is perceived. And when I say perceived, I mean it's not seen with the eyes, heard with the ears, felt with the body, or smelled with the nose. There are no sensory perceptions coming from the apparition, but there are perceptions that are non-sensory, ESP. So it's that which is perceived in a visual way, in an auditory way, in a sensation, physical sensation, or even smelled, that's related to somebody, human personality, mind, soul, consciousness, that can somehow exist in our physical universe after the death of their body, of the body, or sometimes projected outside the living body, because we have a whole subset of living apparition cases. We typically deal with human cases, human apparitions, but we've seen over the years, there have been many reported cases of animals, specifically pets. Poltergeist phenomena is not what you see in the movies, although it is movement of stuff. We have a term for it. It's recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis. So it is psychokinesis, mind over matter. Spontaneous meaning not under direct control. It's unconscious, and it happens again and again, so it is recurrent. We look at poltergeist situations or cases as caused or happening because of a living agent, a living individual unconsciously causing things to happen. This model goes back in 1958, actually goes back much further than that, to a psychoanalytic approach by a man by the name of Nandor Fodor in the early 20th century, who was a parapsychologist and psychoanalyst, finding that there were living people at the center of poltergeist cases and determining that somehow that individual was causing the phenomenon. So we use the scientific method, and we've tested this again and again. And these are the two main names in the field that have led us to this. In the US, we use poltergeist case as a term to refer to cases with physical activity and no indication of an apparition. If an apparition is present and there's activity, if the apparition is doing it, that's a function or feature of the apparition. We don't typically call that a poltergeist case. And the activity is different also, quite a bit. It's less chaotic with apparitions. In the UK, they have been using poltergeist for the term for a really long time as kind of a catch-all for any case with physical activity. And then they make the distinction of what seems to be causing the PK activity. Is it an apparition or a living agent case? The term hauntings refers to places and objects. So the way we look at it, it can be called place memory, certainly if it's a house or a building or some land. It's the ESP, the clairvoyance of information, of the location's history, the activity that happened there. The activity leaves kind of an imprint. It's activity by the living. And that's an important thing to know. So it's like a recording for us. And it doesn't matter if what's recorded, if the figure you see in a haunting that repeats the activity over and over again, if that person who is represented by that image that you're perceiving is dead or not, makes no difference. Just like we can watch movies and we can watch a movie that is from 1930 and everybody's dead. They made it when they were alive. Or I can watch a movie that was made last week and released last week. And pretty much, as far as I know, everybody from that movie is still alive. So they're recordings. So when we have a case which is seemingly ghostly, there's a figure heard, voices heard, footsteps, things like that heard, but not recorded because they're not truly physical. We have the question, is this consciousness or is this a recording? Or for those of you old enough to remember the commercials, is it live or is it Memorex? We find that apparitions are interactive, recordings are not. Hauntings are not interactive, they're repetitive. So as far as what gets recorded in a haunting, it can be emotions. Emotions tend to be the most commonly recorded information and probably the most experienced haunting. You may not have realized you've experienced a haunting. Most people have. If you've ever gone house hunting or apartment hunting, or gone to a new friend's or a new neighbor's home, and you've walked in and it felt weird or bad or really, really good, and it had nothing to do with the decor or smell in the environment, there's a good chance that what you're picking up are emotions imprinted in the environment by the current owners or the previous owners. It's just stuff we leave behind. It can be more than just emotion. It can be information about activities. It can be seeming sounds, seeming sights, and other things as well. It is the living, including, this is where animals often come in, potentially for this, is what's happening. And we're not sure how this happens. We know the environment somehow records the information and we're capable of picking it up. It could be activity that's good. It could be activity that's bad and ugly, or it could just be pretty neutral. People experience the imprint as, and this goes to also how we experience apparitions. We get a sense of energy or emotion. We get a visual impression, auditory, olfactory, physical sensations. In some hauntings, this doesn't happen with apparitions. In some hauntings, people fall into this story of that particular recording and experience as if they're part of that original action. But it's all perception. It's not sensory. So when we get to apparitions, for us, an apparition is conscious. We look for that indication of consciousness, of self-awareness and interactivity, even without knowing how we're using the word consciousness or whether we're using it the way that other scientists might. We're talking about interactivity, self-awareness, the same things we look for in human beings who are alive. So for us, apparitions is an indication of survival of consciousness. The term you also run into in parapsychology journals is discarnate entity. I am an incarnate entity because I am incarnated in my own body. If I am disincarnate, I do not have a body, disembodied. But you can also have apparitions of living people when they are out of body or having a sort of projection experience and people see you as a ghost. We actually have different categories. There are crisis apparitions where someone is in physical crisis, like trapped under a car, for example, or having an extreme fever, and somehow they project themselves to someone they know who gets kind of the image that this, or feeling that there's something wrong with that individual. They may see them as a ghost, which can freak them out quite a bit. We have those apparitions of the living, which seem to be related directly to out-of-body experiences, which can happen in the dream state as well. There are a category of deathbed apparitions, which relate to people having experiences on the deathbed. I'll get to that in a moment. And then we have apparitions of the dead. So again, crisis apparitions appear to a witness, somebody who knows the person represented, if they're in a physical trauma, physical accident, severe illness, severe emotional trauma, threat of imminent death. Those things seem to happen. They're almost like warnings. With the living, it tends to be connected to out-of-body experiences, but it's not always, certainly not a conscious out-of-body experience. Most out-of-body experiences are pretty much spontaneous, accidental, happen in the dream state. But there's some really good apparitions of the living cases on record. Deathbed apparitions, someone is on their deathbed. And when they're close to death, they perceive the apparition of relatives or loved ones or friends, sometimes angels or beings of light or religious figures who are there to take them to the next stage. They will often have long conversations with them, with the conversations being witnessed by hospice workers, or I should say, one-sided parts of the conversation witnessed by the hospice workers. And connected to many deathbed experiences, we're finding something called hyperlucidity, where an individual who had Alzheimer's or some other form of dementia, or was in a coma or heavily sedated, comes out of that state and is capable of having full, normal conversations with the living people around, but also is having conversations with the dead. At the end of the conversation, they might even say something like, oh, it's time for me to go. And because they're being told by these figures that they're perceiving that it's time for them to go. And then they slip back into whatever state they were in and they pass away. More and more of these are being reported by hospice workers. After death apparitions, that's the majority we deal with, of course. But the vast majority that are reported to us, that people experience, seem to happen to people from the time of the individual's death, like the moment of death, to up to 20, it's usually 24 to 72 hours. And I say the majority is 24, maybe 36 hours after death. But it can go a little bit longer, it can be a little bit longer than that. And then that's the last time they experience that individual. Very often, like I said, they happen at or right around the time of death. And that freaks the person out, of course. And then they get a phone call or they have to call someone to find out if there's something wrong with Uncle Harry. I just saw Uncle Harry, he just appeared in my room. And the person they call, who is not with Uncle Harry, also says, Uncle Harry appeared to me. And they finally come to find out that Uncle Harry died approximately at the time they both saw the apparition. We have some very few that are reported weeks, months, or even years after the person's death. And these are not the ones that stick around, by the way. And very few of these cases, the early event cases, do we see physical movement. Some, but very few of them. All right, so how do ghosts perceive without senses? These are questions that I had even before I got into the field when I was a kid. How do they perceive without senses? So think about this. You don't have a body. How do you see the world? How do you hear the world? How do you speak without a voice box? How can you interact if you don't have a physical presence? How do you move things without a body? How do you show up on photos? There's a problem with photos, so many problems with photos, because you have no optical presence. Apparitions do not reflect light or give off light. That's why our eyes typically don't pick them up, but we can still have a visual experience that is a psychic experience. The question I worried about or wondered about since I was a little kid, because of watching TV shows, is where do they get their clothes from? Shouldn't we be seeing naked apparitions? We don't in our culture, for the most part. So what's really going on is, again, it's perception, it's not sensory. We perceive in a seemingly sensory way. It seems that we see, hear, feel, and smell apparitions, but you can have a situation with two people experiencing an apparition that are seeing and hearing the apparition talking. One of the other people that's in the room is hearing the voice of the apparition. Someone else is seeing the apparition, but not hearing the voice. Another person is sensing a presence. Another person is smelling a perfume, cologne, or body odor related to that individual. And then there's three other people in the room that are looking at everybody like they're crazy because nothing's happening for them. So it really can't be a sensory process, because if it was sensory and that local, everyone would pick something up in a similar way, maybe not exactly the same way, but at least a similar way. So we think it tends to be a telepathic process or some projective process. Think of it as broadcasting, right? We also know that recording devices, I don't care what you see on TV shows, they cannot routinely record spirits. And most of the electronic voice phenomena that's out there, which we see on TV, where recording devices seem to get spirit voices. There are so many other explanations. Most of it's not very clear. And there's not even necessarily an indication that a spirit is present otherwise. They're just assuming, because they're told the place is haunted, that, or it has a reputation for being haunted, that the spirits are going to want to communicate with them. And that may be the case sometimes. The only way that that spirit can do that is by affecting the device or the recording medium, not by saying something. Because if they said something, it would not be electronic voice phenomena, it would be voice phenomena, and everybody could hear it. And every recorder could actually record it. So most apparitional experiences are one-time, short-term. They're people who knew the person who died. They rarely include physical effects. Sometimes they have verifiable information. It just really depends on whether that ghost is willing to give it up. But the most verifiable information is seeing someone as an apparition who you did not know had died. That's verifiable. Some few are much longer lived, you might say, sometimes really long term, and can involve witnesses who are strangers, who have no idea who they're looking at or experiencing. And they can eventually find out by reporting it and finding out the backstory. The rare ones includes physical object movement. That's generally after at least a few months or even years. And I will say that an example of this in the media is in the movie Ghost with Patrick Swayze, classic film with Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore. And in that movie, Patrick Swayze's character, Sam, wants to try to affect the physical world. And he can't move anything. He can't do anything like that. So as he's wandering around New York City, he is in the New York subway and he happens to see another spirit, another ghost running through a subway train, knocking newspapers out of people's hands. So he corners that ghost. Apparently ghosts can see each other for sure, at least in the movie world. And he asks him how he does that. And the subway ghost explains to him, you don't have hands. You're not physical. You can't do it physically. So it's your mind that moves it. You need to move it with your mind. And so he takes that to heart and eventually is able to move a penny as a starting point. We see sometimes in these cases with apparitional psychokinesis that things start out small and then they get more controlled, a little bit bigger. Not harmful though. Well, unless the apparition throws a temper tantrum because you're ignoring them, that can happen. All right, so what's going on is they perceive us with ESP, with psi. We somehow pick up what they're broadcasting. They are thinking about how they look and what their appearance is. We have apparitions regularly. The reports talk about someone who died maybe of natural causes. They were in their 80s or 90s. And the people who see the apparition of Uncle Harry, they're surprised. Because Uncle Harry died, he was 92 years old, but here he is appearing to me, and he looks like he's 35. That's weird. It's actually not weird. If you think about how you imagine or picture yourself, most of us, I think, tend to picture ourselves, we may not be realists. We probably think of ourselves as being younger than we actually are. I certainly, in my own self-image, have a darker beard and hair. And eventually I know that when I turn into a ghost later on, I will definitely give myself hair on top as well. I'll go back to my 20s, probably early 20s for that. That's where the clothing comes from. People don't think of themselves without clothing. I haven't heard of too many ghosts at a nudist colony. So, I mean, that would make sense at that place, but really it's the self-image that someone has, of their consciousness holds that is presented to people, that people who are able to pick up and perceive, whether it is auditory, how they sound, whether it is olfactory, how they smell, whether it is visual or otherwise. So it's hallucinatory, but it's a hallucination with an external cause. They look like humans, except for, of course, the animal ghosts. This is a picture from Ghost, the movie Ghost, in the lower left-hand corner, and a screenshot of from the TV show Topper from the 1950s. You can see the two ghosts, George and Marion Kirby, who in this image are transparent, but actually when Topper sees them, they're fully solid and 3D. Nobody else gets to see them though. They are clothed. They're often seen only down to the top of the knees or right below the knees, which is interesting because when you do surveys of large groups of people and ask them to picture themselves, to close their eyes and visualize themselves, and then ask that same group, did you see yourself down to your shoes? A very, very small percentage says they did. Most people say it's only to mid-thigh or the knee. And then the ones who saw themselves down to their feet are fashion conscious about their shoes most of the time. Part of their self-image. They look younger and healthier than when they were last alive. So you don't see the images where people who were killed in a horrendous car accident are bloody and broken. They look solid, they look together. Now, I will tell you that there are instances where people don't see them solid in 3D. They typically see them as 3D, but they may look like, they may be fuzzy, maybe not transparent, but very fuzzy. And sometimes they're so fuzzy, you only see an outline or shadow. That's you. That's not them, generally. That's you and your ability to pick them up. If things move, if they appear in photos and audio recordings, it's the apparition interacting with psi. But we always have to eliminate the non-paranormal in these experiences, in these pieces of evidence. There are a lot of theories and models, terms we use, spirit. I know most mediums talk about a ghost as an apparition who is present, who has not moved on to the other side, whereas a spirit is someone who is projecting back from the other side. Some people talked about telepathic hallucinations, that really there is no apparition present, that I'm having an apparitional experience that is not even external. I think there's a ghost there, and you pick up on my image of there being a ghost here. Just imagination. We have neuropsychological explanations sometimes. And certainly for the physical environment, place memory often confuses people. They sometimes think they actually have a ghost when really they have a recording. People ask, what's it made out of? That's assuming we have survival. We don't know. People talk about the energy of a ghost. We don't know if energy is the right word. Certainly ectoplasm has been used. That was a term coined by Charles Richet in the latter part of the 19th century to describe what physical mediums were producing in the seance room, stuff that apparently the spirits were presenting. That was plasm of spirit or matter of spirit. But that doesn't work that was always visible to people. And even tactile, you could touch it sometimes before it dissolved. So it doesn't really connect to apparitions the way we think of them. In some cultures, they talk about apparitions as being a sort of a recording, but more of a conscious copy of yourself. You're kind of leaving a shadow of yourself behind that can interact. And maybe there's something else. One science fiction comic book writer called it a quantum energy field, or excuse me, quantum particle field that is consciousness, capable of interacting with us. We have no idea, and we can't even detect a ghost directly, regardless of what they show on TV with those pieces of equipment, because we don't know what we're trying to detect. If it's energy, we have no idea what kind of energy. We know what it's not. We don't know what it is. Okay, why are they still here? Well, mediums and psychics and even witnesses have kind of relayed this to us. And honestly, it's hard for me sometimes when I run into psychics or even some specific mediums who say things like, ghosts don't know they're dead no matter what you say. They don't know they're dead. And I've had people tell me that. So it's like, yeah, except our cases completely contradict that. There are some cases where the ghost will argue, get out of my house. This is my house. And people will say, well, you're a ghost, you're dead. No, I'm not. And we don't know that they don't really know they're dead. I'm pretty sure that they know they're dead. I don't know how they would not know that they're dead after at least a little bit. but they may be in denial that they're dead. That's a little different. There's the ghost stories about them having unfinished business. They're still around because they have unfinished business. Most people don't have unfinished business when they die, unless they had to say goodbye. That is the most common form of unfinished business. Basically, having to say goodbye to someone, wanting to say goodbye to someone, or they're not ready to go. They feel uncomfortable with moving on. They feel an attachment to family and property. This time, their unfinished business might be for family, making sure the family's okay after they're dead. They're not there because they have unfinished business. They think the family has unfinished business with them. Sometimes they're afraid of what's next. Again, we hear this from the psychics, the apparitions, the mediums, the witnesses, everybody. And of course, there's the ghost story of the ghost cursed to roam the earth. That's fodder for ghost stories and movies and things like that. We don't find that having anything to do with anything, unless you curse yourself and make yourself think that all the movies say you can't leave your house after you die, when in fact, that's not really the case. We also know that. And there could be other reasons as well. We also think there are likely some other factors. In fact, I tend to think when people ask me, why are there not more ghosts? And the answer, I think, is because it requires a particular psychological personality issue for the individual. So they have a need psychologically or emotionally to stay here. That need could be related to fear or possessiveness or something to do with their family. But I believe, and many of the people in my field believe there are most likely some environmental factors we think having to do with the Earth's magnetic field, but we're not exactly sure, that allow the individual to stick around. Because frankly, there's a lot more people who'd be afraid to go on to the next step, not knowing what it is, that should be sticking around as ghosts. And we can't rule out that there might be some spiritual divine issues, a divine plan, something akin to karma that makes them stay, that they have to kind of work out. We don't know. They tend not to turn evil. You know, there's this thing that when somebody dies, they suddenly become this evil force. Yeah, you are who you are, living and dead, at least initially. And if you're a bully, you're a bully, apparently after death. Fortunately, a bully without a body. If you're an ass after death. If you're a really nice person or very neutral or don't care, you're the same way. You're human. We don't, in my field, deal, except maybe with the pet ghost type of things, we don't really deal with the things that are in pop culture or in religious mythology or beliefs. We don't deal with demons and angels because they don't present in a way that we can do anything within science in any way, shape, or form, because those are basically of some force like a god. And that removes them from the natural world in many ways. There may be entities out there of different types of non-human types that are harmful, but many of us, myself especially, and I know many of my colleagues who do investigations, we don't like to use the word evil or malevolent. Harmful, possibly dangerous, we will sometimes use. I kind of put this to there being, you know, a great white shark is not a demon. It is not evil. It does bad things. It can be extremely dangerous to people or to other entities, other physical beings. It can be extremely dangerous. It is a predator, but it's not a demon. It's not evil. It's not malevolent. It can absolutely kill someone, tear them apart. So why do we use these terms for potentially other things without knowing the true intention of those things, without knowing what's going on? It creates some problems for us when we're trying to work with people and kind of help them with that. Can they harm people or not? Frankly, I would say no. It's so rare for an entity to move a physical object, and frankly, we have more psychokinetic and psychic power as a living being than any entity does. People often ask me, how do you protect yourself before going into a case? I said, I just know they can't hurt me. I know that. I know that. It's just something that, you know, it's not just a belief. I know it. Maybe that's, you know, that's also a little bit of Star Wars for me. I believe I have a little Jedi ability too. The Force will protect me. Charlie Tart years ago was asked about spirits predicting things and giving you answers to stuff. And as Charlie put it, dying does not significantly improve your IQ. All right, maybe if you go to the other side through the near-death experience and stay there, that's a different story. All right, finally coming down to some last things here as I close out so we can have some questions. We use interviewing skills as our main tool of doing investigations and research on apparitions. That's what we do. We work with the witnesses. We work with psychics and mediums, with anything that can interact. And we also talk to witnesses who are not having the experiences. We assess the environment to see if there's any other explanations for things, for bits and pieces of the case. But we are primarily looking at the experiences people have, simply because of the fact that we have no way of detecting the ghost otherwise. I will mention that we've also used hypnosis on occasion, where there was no medium present, and there was a witness who was willing to do hypnosis, and having a hypnotherapist hypnotize that witness and under hypnosis say, okay, you're now a medium. You can consciously connect with the apparition, with the ghost. And then we have communication. And lo and behold, we've actually had verifiable information come through, which I would also have gotten through a medium perhaps. But it's been very exciting to be able to do that in those circumstances where we don't. We always have that question of whose psi is it? Well, it's everybody's, but there are cases where there's no ghost present. There's no discarnate entity involved. It is just the psychic ability of the living and those imprints that are in the environment. Right, the skeptics also talk about there being false conclusions from our perceptions. And yes, it is true. People do make bad judgment calls. And I can't even say they're bad judgment calls. They have incorrect conclusions based on perceptions because they don't know what else could account for that perception. It's about education and knowledge up front, plus what you may have been exposed to in pop culture thinking that it's real. Skeptics often talk about hallucinations. The one I love to hear is mass hallucination. On the USS Hornet Aircraft Carrier Museum here in Alameda, we've had instances where 13 people saw the same apparition. Skeptic says mass hallucination. Okay, that's a problem because there's very little study and literature on mass hallucination. In other words, they're trying to explain something using an explanation that has no evidence or support for it. That's wishful thinking on their part, not just wishful thinking on the part of the witness. They talk about environmental effects, and yes, that is true. There are those false conclusions. And on rare occasion, we have people making things up. Usually they want to sell their story in the movies, though. We have great cases with multiple witnesses. We have great cases with multiple witnesses over time with no prior knowledge of the ghost story. We have verifiable descriptions and information. The patterns of the experiences across apparitional cases are similar. And there's interactivity in the experience between the living and the apparition, regardless of whether this person is a just plain old person or a psychic or medium. Because we're looking at interactivity, and the interactivity suggests survival of consciousness. The best cases for us involve multiple sightings, singly, together, and over time. Interactivity, multiple psychics and mediums providing us the same information without knowing who they're trying to communicate with or where they're going. The encounters over time, especially from strangers with no or limited knowledge, and that information can be verifiable that's communicated to us. So these are the points that we look at for evidence for survival. And for me, apparitions, if we could get more to actually cooperate with us, you know, it's kind of hard to hold a ghost to a timesheet. They may not have a motive or a reason for doing that. So we need more good cases for this. Gertrude Schmeidler, pioneer in my field, and this is paraphrasing her, that survival is one of the only areas of research in which we'll only know if we're right that survival happens when we die. But we'll know more after we figure out what consciousness is, meaning that if there's nothing after death, you won't know anything. And if you believe there's nothing after death and you die and there is something, you'll be surprised. Because ghosts are people too. We would say, certainly the ghosts would say that they are indications of survival. My late great friend Martin Caden, who was a science and science fiction writer and was capable of PK, always said it shouldn't be happening, but it is, in relation to science saying this is not real. Well, science says it shouldn't be happening, but it is, so we have to take a look at it. Here's my contact information. You can see my email, it's profparanormal@gmail.com. Again, I will send out this slideshow to anyone who sends me an email or just lets Holly know I'm also happy to send it to Holly, and she can send it to people as well. You can follow me on Twitter, and I have a new YouTube channel, which is at Ask Professor Paranormal, which will be starting with a live Q&A starting on June 11th on Sunday. And these are my books, including one on reincarnation, channeling, and possession.
This presentation will be on YouTube through the iBert website for all of you too. And with your permission, Loyd, is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. All right. So questions? Susan.
I'm curious if you have any, I don't want to say percentages, but any research that you've done in the apparitions and or the hauntings in certain, I want to say places, like, so I live up in Gold Country, and there's a lot of trauma that's happened here to the Native American Indians and some slave labor with the Chinese, etc. Do you find more of the hauntings and the apparitions in places that have had these kind of traumas?
Not necessarily. You know, one of the problems with hauntings is that they can get recorded over.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you might find that there is that that feeling of trauma. I mean, certainly the emotion around it does carry forward quite a bit, but then somebody builds a development on that property and people start living there, and that can actually kind of either record over or wipe out what was there before.
Okay. Because there's a whole haunted walk.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've been to places in Gold Country. The Hotel Legere is haunted. I know that pretty well. I've been to the St. James Hotel in Volcano, and there's the Union Hotel in Volcano. I mean, there's apparitions in some and hauntings in others, and both in many of those places. So usually in places that have had a lot of human activity over time and have history to them, there's some kind of imprint there.
Okay, interesting. Thank you.
Melissa, is that a hand raise? No?
Yes,
Oh, Michael.
I have one. Yes. Is it possible for places to have their own agenda? Say, we have a mountain of 169 acres that seems to have, over the years of existence here, it's got its own agenda of what it would like to see take place, and it seems to go back in history as far as ancient rituals and so forth.
Yeah, I really can't comment on that. That's, you know, attributing an intention to a property of the land itself. We do know that there are some places, and I've had cases over the years where something's wrong with the land and it affects humans. I know two places here in the Bay Area off the top of my head that I've worked with. And when we've actually been able to measure the geomagnetic field, the Earth's magnetic field there, it's extraordinarily high. And that we know there's evidence that geomagnetic fields, and even scientific studies, that geomagnetic fields locally can affect people's behavior and even cause hallucinations and other things, sometimes causing verifiable hallucinations of the history, which is interesting, but other times affecting people in a way that can be very negative or positive. One of the negative, two places I know that are negative, which you'd actually attribute, you know, this land doesn't want people here. You give it that would be what you'd be saying. And
it decides who it wants.
Yeah, except the fact that it happens to people who are perceiving it, and not everybody does. So this one area which had a high geomagnetic field, there was a 50% divorce rate in this one street in Fairfield over a 10-year period. That's a high divorce rate, right? Mm-hmm. There were several suicides unrelated to each other over that 10-year period on the same street. Also extraordinarily unusual. And there are other things. I had another case in Danville where, again, we measured a strong line of geomagnetic field coming off Mount Diablo right through their house over a 4-year period. I heard from 3 couples that lived in that house. All of them had bad dreams. They moved into the house, they had bad dreams. The first couple ended up getting divorced because their bad dreams were causing them to lose sleep. They were fighting a lot. They moved out and got divorced. Second people, I filed that away after we measured the geomagnetic field. The second folks start describing something that sounded familiar to me. I looked it up. It was the same address. It was that house. I told them to sell the house and move, but to disclose. The third family, a couple that moved in, they were almost on the cusp of getting a divorce from this, and said, we're having these experiences. Where do you live? Danville. I said, oh, you don't happen to be at such and such an address? And they said, yes. And so this was not a psychic thing. It was a receptive thing. They were affected by the geomagnetic field. That's a biological thing, in a way that's very negative. And I kind of liken it to, for most people, think about someone in the back in another room, just in the next room, constantly scratching their nails on the blackboard. And what that does to you.
How is that field developed?
It's the earth itself produces the field. It's earth activity. This is a natural field. The earth itself, the earth has a magnetic field. That's called the geomagnetic field. And it fluctuates on a local level. And there, because sometimes of mineral deposits or fault lines, there are higher than what you'd expect stationary fields for quite some time, or they may come and go in a much higher basis. You can get figures for localized geomagnetic fields, not as specific as a single address, but the USGS, US Geological Survey, their website has information on geomagnetic fields going back a number of years. And they have sensing stations around the country, actually, I think around the world, for that matter.
Thank you. I have probably some other questions, so I'm going to be quiet.
Loyd, tell us a ghost story.
Tell you a ghost story.
Yeah, tell us a ghost story.
Okay, you want a personal ghost story or one
Yes,
I've investigated?
Personal ghost story.
Okay, so my friend Martin Caden, whose picture you saw, I got to know him in 1992. Although I knew his name, I'd read a lot of his books before. He was a science and science fiction writer. He wrote a book called Cyborg, which was the basis of the $6 Million Man TV show, which he actually helped develop. And he worked on the show a little bit over time. And he also helped create The Bionic Woman, how to shape that show originally. He was heavily into the sciences. He had been writing articles on science stuff and aviation especially, and space science since the space program started and even before. Well known in the aviation world, he was a consultant to NASA. He was kind of nominally their historian, even though they weren't paying him for it. He knew, because he'd been around and working with the NASA folks, the astronauts, since before the first satellite was launched. So he was really grounded in the sciences. Also, wrote over 100 science fiction books as well. And I highly recommend his writing as well. I got to know him at a conference on the unexplained, and he was talking about his book, Ghosts of the Air, pilots' experiences with ghosts. And he also was able to demonstrate some PK, which got me interested. And I started visiting him and working with him in Florida. So we got pretty close, talked to him very regularly, visited him every so often in Florida to do some more PK studies with him. And eventually, so this was 92. In 95, he was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. Now, he had been misdiagnosed a year before. He had problems with his vocal cords, actually a little over a year before, by a doctor who said it was just nodes on his vocal cords. Turned out to be thyroid cancer. He was misdiagnosed. And by the time he was properly diagnosed, it had spread throughout his body. He had called me to let me know this from the Mayo Clinic. And I just want to kind of throw this out there. Marty told me that the Mayo Clinic doctors told him to get his affairs in order because he had 8 weeks to live. And Marty's response, he was not your average, wallflower. He was very, very vocal. And he basically, I would have loved to have been actually there to hear him yell a lot of profanity at those doctors. And the point of which he told me was, how dare you tell me my expiration date? Mm-hmm. And then he told them, he just yelled at them and said, you're killing people after however many weeks you tell them, because they give up at that point since they think their expiration date got hit. So that's a mind over matter effect. So he, every week past 8 weeks, he called the Mayo Clinic doctors and yelled at them for over a year and a half. I mean, it had spread throughout his body. So he ended up in home hospice, in a hospice care. and he died in March of 1997. His wife called me that night. And before he died, many times he told me he was going to come back and haunt me. So I told him I welcomed it. Feel free to do whatever the hell you need to make sure you let me know you're here. Most experiences I mentioned happen within a short period after a person's death, a couple days. So when he died, and I was told that he died by Dee Dee, mentally, I raised a glass of rum to him, which I told him I would do. He made me promise to have 3 shots of rum, which I did. And I thought, well, maybe this will make me see ghosts right now. But nothing. Literally, the skeptic saying suggestion, if you wanted to see the ghost, so you will have an experience. Yeah, nothing. Literally nothing. A week goes by, nothing. A week and a half goes by. I was driving early morning to catch a flight up to Portland, Oregon. I was driving through Oakland to the Oakland airport. For a change, it was light traffic at 7, and driving through downtown Oakland, and suddenly my car, which at the time was under 3 months old, still smelled new. Cigar smoke, not actual smoke, but the smell of a very, very stinky cigar. And if you notice, I don't know if you noticed in the picture, but he had a stogie in his mouth. This was his brand. I also felt that there was a presence sitting next to me in the passenger seat. And so I looked over, there's nobody there. I don't have visual experiences with apparitions typically, but others. And so I started talking to him, and I said my goodbyes, and then it goes away. So it was about 5 minutes. This has happened. I fly up to Portland, and once I got there, before I left the airport, this is 97, I grab a payphone, and because there were no cell phones for me, I called Bob Button, who was a good friend of Marty's, a pilot friend who I'd met many times in Florida. He was from New Jersey. And when I got Bob on the phone, I said, "Hey, Bob, it's Loyd Auerbach." And he says, "Loyd, I was just going to call you. You must be psychic." And of course I said, "Yes, Bob, I am. This is something you all should be doing, of course." And I said, "Well, why do you think that, Bob? What were you going to call me about?" He said, "This is incredible. You're not going to believe this." Then he said, "Oh, you probably will believe this. I was flying my Cessna this morning, and at 10 after 10, I'm flying alone here in New Jersey, and at 10 after 10, my cockpit fills up with the smell of stinky cigar smoke. And I swear Caden was with me. And I said my goodbyes, and then it was gone. But that's not the best part," he says. "I just got off the phone with a test pilot friend of Marty's and Bob's, whose name I knew. I never met the guy, from Florida. John had been flying his plane at 10:20 a.m. in Florida, and his cockpit filled up with the smell of cigar smoke and a sense of Caden's presence." So we're talking about this 10:10 Eastern time, 7:10 Pacific time. My experience happened 10 minutes before Bob's, which was 10 minutes before John's. And over time, Bob started talking to a lot of Marty's pilot friends, because Marty was big name in aviation, had a lot of friends of pilots. He was a pilot himself. And there were 25 of us. Which is when Bob stopped. He might have actually found more after this, but he called me a couple of weeks later and said 25 of us, he counted the names, had either in a car alone or in a plane, had the same experience we all had, but never at the same time. So in that initial call, I said to Bob, "How come it took him a week and a half to get to us?" And Bob said, "Well, Caden knew a lot of people. We were probably lower on the list," which would be about right for Martin Caden.
Anybody have more questions? Kaya.
This isn't really a question, it's just a comment. I want to thank you for verifying my experience in a way, or saying more about it, because I saw my grandmother in a dream, and it was like the screen suddenly cleared. It was like the message was, we stopped this program to make a very important announcement. And my grandmother came forth. Now, she looked a little younger, but not very much. Maybe how she looked when I was about 8 years old. And I'm glad you talked about that because I'm noticing details. And she was facing me with a very solemn look on her face. And we begin to turn. At this point, I was in the dream with her. We began to turn like this, facing each other. And it looked like she was reproachful. And I felt, what was it that I did? And she turned around and she very, very rapidly walked up a very small hill, very low hill, up and over and disappeared. Okay, that was the dream. And I forgot about it, at least about 5 a.m. in the morning. I forgot about it. And the next day, my mother called in tears and said, your grandmother. It was exactly the same time. 5 a.m. in the morning, she passed.
Mhm.
Yeah, I didn't talk about the visitations people have in their dreams, where the dream feels so different. It's something that's part of my psychic dreaming book.
Yeah.
And I had my own experience with my grandfather after he passed away. So it's the dream doesn't feel normal. It doesn't feel like a regular dream.
Right.
So it's a very, very, I can't say that's as common as other kinds of apparitional experiences, but these are reported over and over again with this extraordinary difference in sensation to the dream.
Completely. It was kind of like a happening.
Yeah.
It was very real. It was what
Right.
was happening right
Realer than
then.
real is often told me. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Is that lucid dreaming, or is that?
Now, lucid dreaming is when you know you're dreaming. So, I mean, it might have been a lucid dream because you may
I
know.
thought
know in the
maybe I
dream-
was, but on the other hand, I wasn't doing that kind of analysis. I
Yeah,
wasn't
that's it.
doing it to do lucid dreaming. It was just, this is what's going on right now. This is important for you to know and experience. I know that she was saying goodbye,
Right.
right?
Sue
Right.
Barnum, you have a question?
I do have a question. I really appreciate this presentation. I had a vision the day my mother died. I was awake. I just felt a presence in the room. I was resting. She had just died like an hour before. And I felt a presence in the room and I opened my eyes and I saw her face on the wall, big, but transparent, smiling at me with love like she had never had in life. We had a really bad relationship. But she held that gaze for what felt like a long time, and then shrank down, walked across a field, across a little stream, and up a hill. Had died of emphysema, so she couldn't have done that in life. Turned around at the top, waved, made eye contact, and went over the hill. So it was a little bit like yours, Kaya. But I was definitely awake. I was pinching the bedspread and looking around the room, and I don't know what that is, but I had always known that she loved me, and that felt like verification to me. Sure. But you said that if you're evil in life, that you're evil in death.
Well, what I didn't say is that some people do reflect back on their lives after they've died. We do hear that from the mediums when people go to the other side, that they do typically reflect back on their lives. And that's a generalization. People certainly don't turn evil after they've died, but some people who might not have been the best behaviors realize when they died that maybe they should have behaved better.
Well, I went to a psychic many years later after my sister died, and my mother came and apologized for her behavior.
Oh, interesting.
I knew this was a really good psychic reading. There were all sorts of.
Yeah, we see that with mediumship quite a bit. Yeah.
So something happened in my mother when she died that the essence of her came out,
Right. Yeah. We got time for one more question. You ready? Carol?
When you have done your research, Loyd, have you done any brain mapping of mediums or people who receive messages?
I have not, but Jeffrey Tarrant and a few others have done some of the brain mapping research that's been out there. That's what I was talking about before. We do see different activity in the brain when a medium is having a communication with a spirit versus when they're just having a communication with somebody else or making it up. So there has been that. It's not possible to do brain mapping during an investigation because we're always moving around unless someone gives us the money to have a portable fMRI or something else. And we have to then hope that the ghost shows up too. It makes it a little difficult to really know what's going on.
Cool.
But that research still continues. In fact, Jeffrey Tarrant is doing more with mediums to, there's an interest in this. There was even an episode of Dr. Oz, not that he was the best, most credible source, but he did have Teresa Caputo, the Long Island medium, on his show with a doctor who ran a neuroscience institute, which did a lot of EEG work. And they put the brain cap on her. And then before she actually did her mediumship demonstration for people on the show, and there was definitely a change in her brain state between the two, no question about it. I will say that Teresa was willing to do it, but if any of you have seen the Long Island Medium TV show, she's got like big hair. So her biggest fear, it was very clear, her fear and concern was, what's this going to do to my hair?
Yeah, I was fortunate to have the EEG type of mapping done when I was doing a session. And it was funny because I do conscious channeling. So that works a little bit faster than trance channeling does.
Right.
And we had to really slow down the recording to be able to see where I went into conscious channeling. But the validation actually came from the message that I received from the entity that was in the room.
Interesting.
I had no knowledge of that entity whatsoever, but the person who was doing the experiment was able to validate everything that was said.
Great. That's great.
Yeah.
Terrific.
Very cool. It was a very interesting talk. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Loyd, so much. We appreciate you.
Very welcome.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to take off and take a look at my wife's ankle.
Yes. Well, we'll send her some healing.
Okay, please do.
Send Julie some healing.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.